The incredible story of Sarah, Abraham's wife, and God's promise fulfilled Sarah, one of the most important figures in the biblical narrative, is far more than just Abraham's wife. Her life was marked by seemingly insurmountable challenges, transformative faith, and the fulfillment of a divine promise. To truly understand Sarah's story, we must explore the pivotal moments of her life and reflect on her role as the matriarch of Israel and an example of spiritual perseverance. The ancient city of Ur of the Chaldeans, Sarah's birthplace, was one of the great centers of Mesopotamian civilization. Renowned for its rich culture, flourishing economy, and complex religious practices, Ur was located in what is now southern Iraq. Towering ziggurats defined the skyline, serving as places of worship and sacrifice to gods like Nana, the moon deity, who was the city's principal god. Life in Mesopotamia was highly structured, with kings and priests at the top of a strict hierarchy, while most of the population consisted of farmers and craftsmen. Women played vital roles within the domestic sphere, but were confined by societal expectations that emphasized marriage, motherhood, and submission to family needs. For a woman like Sarah, living in a society where the ability to bear children determined much of a woman's status and personal value, her barrenness was an immense burden, both emotionally and socially. The call of God to Abraham, instructing him to leave Ur, represented a radical break not just for him, but also for Sarah. Ur was a well-developed city with paved streets, an advanced irrigation system, and a vibrant community life. Abraham and Sarah were part of a stable and prosperous society. Leaving all of this behind for an uncertain promise required extraordinary courage and faith. Sarah was far from a passive figure in this story. Her decision to accompany Abraham on his journey was significant, as it meant abandoning her roots, family, and security. Although the biblical narrative often emphasizes Abraham's role, we must not underestimate Sarah's faith. She embarked on this uncertain journey without having received God's call directly, relying solely on her trust in Abraham and his belief in the divine promise. The religious culture of Ur highlights the stark contrast between the polytheism of the time and the emerging monotheistic faith of Abraham and Sarah. In Ur, gods were often feared, seen as capricious beings whose blessings or curses depended on regular sacrifices and elaborate rituals. The decision of Abraham and Sarah to follow a single, invisible God, who did not require material offerings in the same way, marked a profound departure from the prevailing spiritual paradigm. Even without fully understanding God's plan, Sarah carried an implicit hope that her life had a greater purpose. This hope was repeatedly challenged by the reality of her barrenness and the trials that would come throughout her journey. As Sarah and Abraham traveled, leaving behind the bustling streets of Ur and venturing into unknown territories, their faith was tested in ways few could endure. The shift from an advanced urban environment to a nomadic desert life was drastic. They faced daily challenges, from finding food and water to constant threats from natural dangers and human adversaries. Yet, more importantly, this journey marked the beginning of Sarah's spiritual transformation. In leaving Ur, she also left behind the belief systems of her childhood. Gradually, she began to learn about the God of Abraham, a God who was not only powerful, but also deeply personal, faithful, and intricately involved in their lives. The relationship between Sarah and Abraham strengthened during their journey. Despite the hardships, they shared a common faith and a mutual commitment to the divine promise. While Abraham is often remembered as the father of faith, Sarah played an equally crucial role as his companion and partner in this calling. The grandeur of Ur of the Chaldeans symbolized the world Sarah was leaving behind. In contrast, God's promise offered something radically new, not just a land, but a future in which Sarah would play a central role in God's divine plan to redeem and bless humanity. This transition from a comfortable life in Ur to a faith-driven journey stands as one of the most fascinating aspects of Sarah's story. She was not just physically relocating. Her soul was being shaped and prepared for the extraordinary role she would fulfill as the matriarch of God's chosen people. The challenge of barrenness and the plan with Hagar. The barrenness of Sarah was more than a personal sorrow. It was a silent cry of despair in a society that placed motherhood as the pinnacle of female achievement. In the Mesopotamian culture, and among the semi-nomadic tribes of Canaan, being a mother was not only a blessing, but a vital necessity for family survival and the continuation of legacy. Children represented the future, a source of labor and protection in old age. For Sarah, the absence of children was an emotional, social, and spiritual burden. The promise of God to Abraham that he would become the father of many nations seemed almost cruel in the face of Sarah's barrenness. How could she, with the passing years and no sign of pregnancy, contribute to this promise? The pressure mounted with each passing year. Her position as Abraham's wife, someone called by God for a grand mission, made her burden even heavier. Every pitying glance and every awkward silence in the tent, when descendants were discussed, reinforced her sense of failure. It was in this context that Sarah made a desperate decision. She gave her servant Hagar to Abraham so that through her they might have a child. This act, while unusual today, was an acceptable practice at that time. The culture allowed for a servant to serve as a surrogate to perpetuate the lineage of her master, and the child would be legally considered the wife's offspring. To Sarah, this seemed like a logical, practical, and perhaps even necessary solution to fulfill the divine promise. However, this decision, far from solving the problem, unleashed a series of emotional and relational conflicts. Once Hagar conceived Abraham's child, her relationship with Sarah drastically changed. Hagar began to despise Sarah, transforming from a humble servant into someone who saw herself as superior. Emotionally fragile, Sarah reacted with anger and resentment. These feelings drove her to confront Abraham, placing him in a difficult position to mediate between his wife and his servant. Abraham responded by giving Sarah the authority to deal with Hagar as she deemed best. This led to harsh treatment, forcing Hagar to flee into the wilderness, pregnant and abandoned. At this point, the story took an unexpected turn. God intervened. In the wilderness, Hagar encountered an angel of the Lord who comforted her and promised that her son, Ishmael, would have a grand future. He would become the father of a great nation, but his life would be marked by conflict and challenge. This divine intervention demonstrated that even in situations marked by human failures, God remains sovereign. Hagar, though a secondary figure in the narrative, was seen and heard by God, who cared for her and the child she carried. Meanwhile, for Sarah, the presence of Ishmael became a constant reminder of her barrenness. Although Ishmael was a source of joy for Abraham, for Sarah, he represented an open wound, a visible testament to her attempt to hasten God's plan. The arrival of Ishmael did not bring the expected peace, but instead deepened the tensions within Abraham's household. The relationship between Sarah and Hagar became a symbol of the complications that arise when spiritual problems are addressed with human solutions. Sarah's decision to give Hagar to Abraham may have seemed practical, but in reality, it revealed a lack of complete trust in God's timing. However, it is important to note that God did not abandon Sarah in her doubt. He worked behind the scenes, shaping her story and building her faith. The story of Sarah and Hagar also serves as a profound reflection on the complexities of human emotions. Sarah felt rejected by her own condition, Hagar felt empowered by her pregnancy, and Abraham was caught in the middle of an emotional and relational conflict that would impact generations. This dynamic serves as a reminder that even the great heroes of faith were real people with struggles, doubts, and moments of failure. God, however, did not allow human errors to derail his plan. He promised Abraham and Sarah that the child of the promise would come through her, not another woman. This promise was a testament to the unshakable faithfulness of God despite human shortcomings. Moreover, this part of the story teaches us something profound about divine timing. Sarah tried to speed up God's plan because, in her view, he was taking too long. How often do we act in the same way in our own lives? When God's promises seem distant, it is tempting to seek shortcuts or human solutions. But the story of Sarah and Hagar reminds us that even when we fail, God is capable of redeeming our decisions and continuing to fulfill His purposes. The birth of Ishmael was a significant event, but it was also a prelude to something greater. He was not the promised child, but his story was intertwined with that of Sarah and Abraham. God was preparing the stage to demonstrate that His promise did not depend on human circumstances or limitations. Sarah still had a long journey ahead, both emotionally and spiritually. Ishmael represented a complicated chapter in her life, but it would not be the final one. What was coming would be the realization of the impossible, a testimony that God not only makes promises, but fulfills them in extraordinary ways and at the perfect time. The divine promise and the change of name. As time passed, God's plan for Abraham and Sarah began to unfold in a clearer and more direct way, completely challenging human logic. Abraham and Sarah were no longer young. Their bodies naturally were not capable of conception, but God does not operate within the limits of biology or human expectations. He works in the supernatural, and what seemed impossible for them was exactly the setting where God would demonstrate His power. It was in this context that God visited Abraham in one of the most symbolic moments of the narrative, the visit of three men in human form, often interpreted as a divine manifestation known in theology as a theophany. These visitors appeared while Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day, a detail that highlights the cultural emphasis on hospitality at the time. Abraham immediately welcomed them, offering water to wash their feet, a place to rest, and a carefully prepared meal. This visit was not just a social interaction. During the meal, the visitors directly announced that within 1 year, Sarah would have a son. This declaration was so unexpected and extraordinary that Sarah, who was listening behind the tent, silently laughed. Her laughter was not merely disbelief, it was also a reflection of years of pain, disappointment, and an internal struggle to believe in something that seemed completely out of reach. The dialogue that followed is fascinating. God, perceiving Sarah's laughter, questioned her, asking why she had laughed and if there was anything too hard for the Lord. At that moment, Sarah, perhaps embarrassed or afraid, denied laughing, but God insisted, saying that she had indeed laughed. This small detail in the narrative carries profound emotional and spiritual weight. Not only did God acknowledge Sarah's skepticism, but He also confronted her with His truth. Nothing is too hard for Him. This episode is significant for several reasons. First, it shows that God was directly involved in Sarah's life, addressing not only her actions, but also her innermost thoughts and emotions. Second, it highlights God's patience. He did not rebuke Sarah harshly for her disbelief, but instead reaffirmed His promise, showing that His faithfulness does not depend on human perfection. This moment marked a turning point in Sarah's story. Until then, she had often been a reluctant participant, acting out of her own limitations and doubts. But here, she began to be placed at the center of God's promise, not just as Abraham's wife, but as someone called for an extraordinary purpose. Another fascinating aspect of this period is how God reaffirmed His covenant with Abraham in a tangible way, the rite of circumcision. This symbolic act was a physical mark of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants, including Isaac, who was yet to be born. Although the narrative emphasizes Abraham as the primary recipient of the promise, it becomes clear that Sarah was essential to the fulfillment of this covenant. The story also reflects the tension between human timing and divine timing. For Abraham and Sarah, the delay in the fulfillment of the promise seemed endless, but God was acting according to His own perfect timeline. This waiting period, though painful, had a purpose: to shape their faith and prepare their hearts for the impact of the fulfilled promise. It is also important to note that the reaffirmation of the promise came at a moment when Abraham and Sarah were vulnerable. They were living as foreigners, without their own land, and dealing with daily survival challenges. Even so, God chose this moment to ensure that His promise would be fulfilled, emphasizing that He is faithful even in the most difficult circumstances. This narrative also points to the inclusive and sovereign nature of God. He was not just promising a child to Sarah, He was revealing that through her He would fulfill a plan that would span generations and nations. The birth of Isaac would not only be a personal event, but also a milestone in the history of redemption, pointing to the future birth of another promised son, Jesus Christ. Finally, the moment when God confronted Sarah's laughter serves as a reminder that He sees not only our actions, but also our deepest thoughts. He understands our doubts, internal struggles and failures, yet in His grace, He continues to work to accomplish His plans in our lives. As Sarah faced her doubts, God was transforming her story. Within 1 year, the promise would be fulfilled, and she would experience what it meant to be completely renewed by God's power and faithfulness. Chapter 5. The Tests of Beauty in Egypt and Gerar. The story of Sarah in the episodes of Egypt and Gerar invites us to reflect on the complexity of her life as a woman of remarkable beauty in a historical context where physical appearance could be both a blessing and a vulnerability. In both instances, the narrative highlights how Sarah's beauty played a central role in the challenges she faced, while God used these situations as part of His greater plan to preserve the promise of a sacred lineage. In Egypt, Sarah's beauty caught the attention of Pharaoh's officials, and this was no coincidence. In the Egyptian royal court, beauty was highly valued, especially in women who could be deemed worthy of joining the Pharaoh's harem. The wealth and culture of Egypt at that time emphasized adornments and beauty rituals, from elaborate jewelry to the use of natural cosmetics such as kohl for the eyes and pigments for the skin. Sarah, even at the age of 65, stood out not only for her physical appearance, but also for a striking presence that captured the attention of those around her. Abraham's decision to ask Sarah to present herself as his sister reveals the intense fear he felt upon entering a territory where the customs and laws could be hostile. This strategy was not entirely unfounded. Historical accounts suggest that pharaohs often took foreign women into their harems, especially those seen as advantageous for political or cultural alliances. Even so, Abraham's choice placed Sarah in an extremely vulnerable position, exposing a lapse in his faith during a critical moment. However, God was present and intervened powerfully. The Bible recounts that plagues afflicted Pharaoh and his household. Although the specifics of these plagues are not detailed, they were likely severe illnesses or visible afflictions that alarmed the court and prompted an investigation into their cause. Upon discovering that Sarah was, in fact, Abraham's wife, Pharaoh immediately acted to rectify the situation, returning Sarah and allowing the couple to leave Egypt with additional wealth. This episode serves as a testament to how God protected Sarah in circumstances where she could have been irreversibly harmed. Years later in Gerar, a similar event occurred, albeit with some important differences. The historical context of Gerar, a city-state in the region of the Philistines, is significant. Governed by King Abimelech, Gerar was a place where power was often exercised through strategic marriages, and taking women into the royal harem was a common practice among the elite. Even at this advanced stage of her life, around 90 years old, Sarah was still regarded as a woman of exceptional beauty and value. The repetition of Abraham's strategy to protect himself by asking Sarah to present herself as his sister reflects not only his fear, but also the cultural pressures of the time. In Gerar, as in Egypt, God intervened before any harm could occur. The divine appearance to Abimelech in a dream is one of the most dramatic moments in this narrative. God warned him directly of the danger of taking Sarah as his wife, stating that she was married and that any attempt to consummate such a union would be a grave sin. This event underscores the seriousness with which God was protecting not only Sarah, but also the larger plan of his promise. Sarah's infertility and the promise of Isaac made it essential that she be the sole mother of the promised lineage. Any interruption to this plan, such as a union with Abimelech, could compromise the integrity of the divine promise. Abimelech, upon receiving this message in his dream, demonstrated a surprising level of reverence and obedience. He immediately restored Sarah to Abraham and went further, giving them gifts and land as a gesture of recognition of the divine favor upon them. This response not only averted a potential conflict, but also elevated the status of Abraham and Sarah in the region, enhancing their reputation as individuals blessed by God. These two episodes, in Egypt and in Gerar, also shed light on broader cultural aspects of women's roles and the dynamics of power in ancient kingdoms. Women like Sarah were often treated as bargaining tools or objects of desire in royal courts, but God transformed these situations into opportunities to demonstrate his sovereignty and faithfulness. Furthermore, these events highlight Sarah's faith. Although her beauty was an important factor in the trials she faced, she also had to rely on divine protection in situations where her safety was completely beyond her control. God not only rescued her from these circumstances, but also used these moments to reaffirm the promise that she would be the mother of a sacred lineage. For Abraham, these episodes were tests of faith that revealed his vulnerability to human fear. Despite his role as the patriarch of faith, he demonstrated weaknesses that are universal to all humans. However, God did not abandon him. Instead, God reaffirmed his faithfulness, showing that his divine plan did not rely on Abraham's perfection, but on his sovereign power. These episodes teach us profound lessons about how God cares for his people, even in situations where they are vulnerable or make mistakes. He protected Sarah, preserved his promise, and transformed difficult circumstances into opportunities to demonstrate his power and grace. These tests of beauty were more than mere challenges. They were moments when God reaffirmed his sovereignty and his commitment to fulfilling his promises, regardless of human failures or cultural pressures, the laughter of unbelief and the fulfillment of the promise. The promise of God that Sarah would conceive a child, even in her advanced age, was one of the most extraordinary declarations in the biblical narrative. From a human perspective, everything seemed to conspire against this possibility. Sarah, at 90 years old, had long abandoned any hope of motherhood. Modern medical science would have described her condition as biologically impossible. Yet for God, it was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his sovereignty. Sarah's laughter, which occurred upon hearing the promise that she would bear a son, was more than a simple expression of disbelief. It reflected years of pain, despair, and accumulated frustration. Sarah had carried the weight of barrenness for decades, living with the social and cultural stigma that reduced a woman's value to her ability to bear children. Her laughter was, in part, an emotional reaction to the idea that after so much time, something so extraordinary could happen. This pivotal moment in Sarah's life marked a significant transition in her spiritual journey. Although she laughed in disbelief, God responded with a direct question: "Is there anything too hard for the Lord?" This question resonated deeply, confronting Sarah with the reality that God's power is not limited by human circumstances. It is worth noting that Sarah's laughter was not condemned by God, but transformed into a symbol of celebration. When Isaac was born, she joyfully declared, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The name Isaac, meaning he laughs, became an eternal reminder of this moment of transformation. The birth of Isaac was more than a personal event for Sarah. It was a historical and spiritual milestone. It represented the beginning of the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, a promise that would extend across generations. Isaac was not just the child of the promise. He was living proof that God was faithful, even when all seemed impossible. Beyond the spiritual significance, the birth of Isaac brought a cultural and emotional renewal for Sarah. For decades, she had lived under the weight of the stigma of her barrenness. Now, as the mother of an heir, she became an honored and exalted figure. This also solidified her position as a matriarch in the biblical narrative, a woman who, despite her struggles and doubts, was chosen by God for an essential role in His plan. Another important aspect of this chapter in Sarah's life is how it reflects God's sovereignty over time and circumstances. The long and painful wait, though difficult, was part of the divine plan. By fulfilling the promise at a time that seemed humanly impossible, God demonstrated that His timeline is perfect and His promises never fail. The impact of Isaac's birth extended beyond Sarah's immediate family. He symbolized the beginning of something much greater, the formation of a nation and eventually the arrival of the Messiah. In this context, Sarah and Isaac point to the future fulfillment of God's promises through Jesus Christ, who would also be conceived miraculously, ushering in a new covenant with humanity. Culturally, Isaac's arrival redefined Sarah's role. Previously, she was associated with the shame of barrenness. Now she was seen as blessed by God, the mother of a child who carried the future of an entire nation. This brought changes not only in how others perceived Sarah, but also in how she viewed herself. However, Isaac's birth did not erase the complexities of the family dynamic. The presence of Ishmael, Abraham's son with Hagar, remained a source of tension. As the mother of the promised child, Sarah now faced new challenges as she sought to secure Isaac's place as the legitimate heir. These tensions would be addressed in future chapters, but here we see the beginning of a new phase in Sarah's life, marked by the joy of the fulfilled promise and the responsibility of her role as a matriarch. This story reminds us that God is not limited by our circumstances or failures. He is faithful to fulfill His promises, even when they seem impossible. Sarah's laughter, which began as a reflection of doubt, was transformed into a testimony of celebration and gratitude. Chapter 7. The conflict with Hagar and Ishmael. The birth of Isaac was a moment of joy for Sarah and Abraham, but it also brought to light long-standing family tensions. The story of Hagar and Ishmael, which had already been marked by past conflicts, became even more complicated after the arrival of the promised son. Before Isaac, Abraham had fathered a son with Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant. Ishmael was born out of an attempt to fulfill God's promise through human means. While the decision was culturally acceptable at the time, its emotional and social consequences unfolded as the years went by. After Isaac's birth, Sarah realized that Ishmael's role in the family had become a threat to her son's future. This tension came to a head during the celebration of Isaac's weaning, a culturally significant event of the time. During the banquet, Sarah noticed Ishmael mocking Isaac, an act that symbolized a deeper conflict over inheritance and position within the family. For Sarah, this provocation was enough to decide that Ishmael and his mother could no longer remain in the same household as Isaac. She asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, stating, "The son of this slave woman shall not share the inheritance with my son Isaac." This request was not merely an emotional reaction, it was a measure to protect Isaac's role as the legitimate heir to the promise. Abraham, deeply distressed, hesitated to fulfill Sarah's request because he loved Ishmael. At this moment, God spoke directly to Abraham, affirming that the lineage of the promise would be established through Isaac, but also assuring that Ishmael would be blessed and become the father of a great nation. With this guidance, Abraham made the difficult decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away, providing them with basic provisions for their journey. Hagar and Ishmael wandered into the wilderness, where they faced a moment of great despair. However, God intervened once again, appearing to Hagar and promising that Ishmael would be protected and would prosper. He provided water and reaffirmed his promise that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. This episode marked the definitive end of Sarah and Hagar's coexistence, allowing Isaac to grow up without the tensions and rivalries that could have jeopardized his role as the heir of the promise. The story of Sarah and Hagar reveals the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of decisions made outside God's timing. While these experiences were marked by conflict, they also highlight God's faithfulness in caring for all involved and ensuring that his greater plan was fulfilled. The death and legacy of Sarah. Sarah lived to the age of 127 years, a remarkable longevity, especially considering the many adversities she faced throughout her life. Her death was a significant moment not only for her family, but also for the history of Israel, marking the end of an era for Abraham and the beginning of a lasting impact that would extend for generations. The biblical narrative tells us that Sarah passed away in Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. This location held great significance as it was part of the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. Sarah's death, therefore, occurred in a place that symbolized the partial fulfillment of the divine promise. Deeply grieved by the loss of his companion, Abraham took deliberate steps to honor Sarah in a dignified and meaningful way. He approached the Hittites, the inhabitants of the region, to purchase a specific burial site for Sarah, the Cave of Machpelah. This act carried immense spiritual and historical weight, as it marked Abraham's first acquisition of land within the Promised Territory. Abraham's negotiation with the Hittites is one of the most detailed episodes in the biblical narrative, underscoring its importance. He insisted on paying the full price for the cave and the surrounding field, refusing to accept the land as a gift. This transaction established a legal and spiritual precedent for the people of Israel, symbolizing the gradual realization of God's promise. Sarah was buried in the cave of Machpelah, becoming the first to rest in what would become a landmark for future generations. Abraham would later be buried alongside her, as would Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah, making Machpelah one of the most sacred sites in Jewish history. However, the legacy of Sarah extends far beyond her burial. As the matriarch of Israel, she is remembered for her faith, struggles, and transformation over a life filled with challenges. Sarah was a woman who, despite her flaws and doubts, played a central role in God's plan for the redemption of the world. In the New Testament, Sarah is highlighted in Hebrews chapter 11, often referred to as the Hall of Faith. She is celebrated as one who, through faith, received the power to conceive despite her advanced age, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. This acknowledgement is a testament to her spiritual journey, moving from doubt to trust, from barrenness to fertility, and from laughter of disbelief to laughter of celebration. Sarah's story also reaches beyond her time, offering inspiration to all people of faith. As the mother of the promise, her life serves as an example of how God works through imperfect individuals to fulfill his perfect plans. Her journey challenges us to trust in God, even when his promises seem distant or impossible. Sarah's death marked the conclusion of her earthly journey, but her influence lives on in the stories of Scripture and the faith of countless generations. She was not just Abraham's wife or Isaac's mother. She was a woman who lived an extraordinary life, chosen by God to be part of something far greater than herself.